with Tim Brown, CEO of IDEO.
Hi there, good to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited for another Tea Time with Tim this morning. And this one is just with learners who are inside of Leading for Creativity. So welcome everyone. We're thrilled that you're here and thank you for joining us. Today, what we thought we would do is take some of your questions from inside of the platform, inside of the course, and also you're invited to participate in the live chat here on screen. If you go down, there's a little bar in your screen down at the bottom and a chat button. If you want to get warmed up, feel free to introduce yourselves, let us know who you are, where you're dialing in from today, and then as you have questions, please feel free to share them with us. So thanks for joining us again today. How's everything going with you lately?
Good, good, good. It's been great to follow what's been going on the course. It's really exciting after a year and a half's work to be at the point of people actually trying to learn some of the content and see whether we've got it right or not.
Definitely. And I know we did a review of some of the rituals that people were submitting. Was there anyone that you were excited about?
Oh, I mean, lots of interesting thoughts and explorations going on. I think it's one of those topics that's just got immense potential, and so I'm looking forward to over time how we discover all kinds of new rituals, and maybe we'll steal some of them. I'm a big one for, I'm of the Picasso school of thought, which is great artists steal. So I'm looking forward to having a few rituals that we can steal for IDEO.
Definitely. I know in San Francisco last night, we had a meetup, a learning circle, where we had 20 people from all different practices. We had people from healthcare, from banking, a librarian was there from UC Santa Cruz, and people were sharing their rituals and their process, and it was just fantastic. So if you're on with us again this morning and you were with us last night, thank you so much. So with that, let's see, we've got a few people coming in. Angel in from Mexico. Hi to Jill in Vancouver. We've got Patricia in Sao Paulo. People calling in from Quito, excellent, and New Zealand, Houston, and Cambridge. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And again, just one more time, there's a little chat button in the bottom of Zoom, and you can post your questions to us there. So with that, I thought I'd warm us up just a little bit. I know we're all fascinated with leadership journeys here, and I thought it would be fun to dig in a little bit more to your personal leadership journey. And so one thing I wanted to start off asking you is about, do you remember the very first thing that you led, even as a young adult?
I mean, my first memory of leading, and I was not a natural leader. I was a very quiet kid at school. I wasn't one of the kind of popular people or anything like that. So, I was hopeless at team sports, so I definitely didn't lead anything with those. So the first memory I have, actually, I grew up in England, as you might tell from the accent, and in England, where I grew up out in the countryside, the Boy Scout movement was still pretty popular back then. This is a very long time ago. So I was a Boy Scout. And the first thing I led was this team, I think there were 4 of us, on this big hike thing that we had to do out in the middle of nowhere in Wales. And it was part of a competition. And we set off and ended up in this fog and got completely lost on this mountainside somewhere. And we had to figure out what to do. And we kind of completely screwed it up, basically. We ended up coming off the mountainside, literally miles away from where we should be. And we had to march all the way around the bottom of this mountain to get ourselves home. And so it was a bit of a disaster. But in some ways, it was a great leadership moment, because we were basically in the middle of failure, and we had to figure out what to do and not lose our cool and actually kind of try and enjoy it. And at the end, I actually felt a real sense of accomplishment, even though we'd completely messed it up, because we dealt with it, right? And we got back home and got to where we were supposed to be, and all that kind of thing. So even though we were about 8 hours late.
How old were you when this
13, I think, 13. Something like that. 13, 14.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I remember having to deal with kind of leadership problems in the moment.
Do you still like hiking today?
I do like hiking, but I don't go on big things like that anymore. I did for a long time, actually, as a kid, right up through college, but not so much anymore.
Yeah. So if that first being thrown into leadership experience was about figuring out how to fail gracefully.
Yes, on reflection, that's what it was, but I didn't know that I felt that at the time.
Yeah. What about, can you remember the first time you were leading something when you got some constructive feedback and you learned that there were things you needed to do to shift?
Yeah, it wasn't so much that I was leading something, but the first very strong feedback I got that helped me become a better leader, and this is something I still deal with today, which is, I remember when I was first in the San Francisco studio, I first moved out from the UK, And the guy who ran the studio really had a go at me one time about how I just never would give up on the idea I had. I was very argumentative. And I had an idea, and even in a bigger, I was the youngest person in the office, and with much more experience, and I would just keep arguing for when my idea was the right idea. And he got really ticked off at me one day. He said, "Why do you always argue all the time?" So that caught me a bit frustrated. I never even thought about it before. As far as I'm concerned, the idea is what matters. But it was that moment I realized, the thing that's made me creative, which is the quality of my ideas, isn't necessarily going to make me successful in the future. And that was the first moment I realized that if I was going to become a leader, if I was going to become effective as a leader, that I would have to think differently about my ideas versus other people's ideas. And I would probably have to start listening a bit more. Now, it took me another 10 or 15 years to get any good at it, I think. But it was a moment when I realized, just the idea itself is not the only thing that matters in a creative environment. So that was a pretty important moment.
Nice. Well, that's a great story that certainly helps us understand the roots of what created the course.
Exactly. I mean, it's been something I've been dealing with through my whole career. It's not letting the idea be the only thing. It's important, obviously, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah, great. That's a lovely way to start. I think we've got a few people coming in with some questions. I'm just going to pull a few. We've done some work to go back to the platform and see questions that we feel like we haven't answered yet in any other way. So I thought I'd start off with a few of those as we wait for others to roll in. And so the first one I wanted to share is from Othman in Geneva. And he's working out something that I think a lot of people have been weighing inside of the course. So in lesson 1, it said that a leader must lead with a strong point of view. This is from Othman's writing. And that he must be extremely persuasive to get people to follow him and push hard to stretch what's possible. At the same time, there's also this point about asking questions. And so Othman says, where do you place a cursor on when a leader needs to take a strong point of view, which might not be accepted by the team, and when the leader needs to involve others, ask questions?
Well, I mean, I think the whole point here, and one of the most important underlying themes of the course is, this idea that in order to maximize the creative output of any organization or any team, you have to unlock the creativity of everybody or as many people in that team as possible, right? So this is the balance we're trying to make. This is what we're trying to say about the sort of this new way of leading versus how we might have thought about leadership in the past, where leadership was a lot to do with decision making, and ideas and essentially were part of the decision making process, but they didn't necessarily have value in their own right. And so we're trying to say, look, we're trying to separate a little bit this idea of decision making and this idea of how you get the best ideas, right? Where do the best ideas come from? And all of the evidence is that the best ideas can come from anywhere, right? They're not the privilege only of the leader. So what we're trying to handle here is that tension, right?
Yeah.
So the way I think about it is, as a leader, one needs to be thinking constantly is, what do I need to do to unlock the creativity of my team or my organization? And that is not simply just to leave them alone, right? It's not to give them a blank canvas, because we also know that leads to kind of creative anarchy, if you like. And so where we get to is this idea that by giving some direction through questioning, through directing the way in which the lens, if you like, through which the team starts to look at the problem, that's a way of giving guidance, but without reducing the creative output of the team. So it's that tension. And then there are moments when the creative, so that's a decision-making process. And essentially, as a leader, you are saying, I think the best way for us to look is through this set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then one has to have the openness to learn from that and redirect as necessary.
Yeah. When you walk into a room and you feel like there's a moment where a decision or where you feel that instinct in yourself that this is a deciding moment, how do you make a decision just in yourself about like whether to lean in and decide or whether to hold that space?
Well, it depends on the context, right? Because there are definitely moments when it really is a decision, right? Where you've maybe got several creative options and the team is struggling with how to make the decision. And there's a lot of kind of emotion involved in that process. And we rely at IDEO often on our clients helping us in that process because they understand different contexts from us. So sometimes it is about saying, we've learned enough to know that this is the right option, right? But often it's it's not so clear as that. Often it's about what do we do next and where do we go next. And that's when the questioning mode is much more useful, right? Because you're not saying this is the choice, you're saying this is the way we're going to direct from here, or where we're going to explore from here. And so that discipline of knowing when to make a decision or when to essentially guide through asking a question is one that one just learns over time. It's difficult. And if you're somebody like I am, which tends to be somebody who can be quite decisive sometimes, it takes real restraint and self-discipline to first say the way I try and do it is, the first question is, should I be asking a question here? And go through that loop before I say, here might be a decision, or here's a choice I might make. It can be difficult. It's back to that same thing I was talking about before, which is arguing for ideas.
Yeah. It's just putting that filter there.
Well, that filter there in your own mind, thinking for a moment is what's the best way to have the team move forward successfully.
Yeah. Great. Takes us back to that place of hiking, exploring, having a compass, and deciding.
It's always an exploration.
Yeah. Okay, another question from Kevin DeBell in Washington, D.C. This has come up a lot in the course, and I think it's a great topic that we are very passionate about. How do I measure the development of creative culture? In discussion with teams, I can only get as far as folks telling me research says it takes 7 years, but we know culture change is slow. How do we think about measuring creative culture?
Well, culture is essentially made up of values and behaviors, right? So, values you can assess in an organization, and a shift in values, or that tends to be the bit that's slowest, I think, to change. One of the reasons why people do talk about 7 years is because changing values is a very difficult thing to do. Changing behaviors can be a little bit faster. You can support a change in behavior, but you can start to measure those behaviors, and some of them might be quite tangible. Some organizations simply measure, how many brainstorms are we having now compared to what we used to. That's a pretty crude thing, but it's a start, right? One that we've used quite a lot in the past is to attempt to measure the behaviors associated with moving from ideas to action. And so, for instance, measuring the length of time it takes you to go from an idea to a prototype in front of a customer or consumer. And we work with organizations where we've measured that coming down from 18 months down to a few weeks, right? And we've used tools like better collaborative innovation spaces, a permission to use much rougher, less finished forms of prototyping. There are mechanisms and tools you can use to accelerate those behaviors. And so I think that's a good place to start. Ultimately, you want to measure impact, right? Ultimately, you want to measure what the output of a creative organization is. And so you certainly want to know what your theory of impact is. Like, what's your hypothesis for how your organization or team is going to have impact? But it's going to be quite a long time before you can measure that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, so we're talking a lot about measuring behavior. So those can be micro behaviors, more brainstorms, more customer interviews, shorter times to prototype.
Yeah.
Definitely thinking about outcomes. Yeah. And then I know one of the things that we've also been thinking about at IDEO is thinking about survey-based measurements. So certainly self-report, or the entire community reporting on behaviors, values, culture change. So different things that are going on there. I think there are surveys that we're developing, as well as other things about just satisfaction.
Yeah, I think engagements are really important. There's the statistics on engagement in organizations, in business organizations in the US is terrible, to be honest. It's way below 50% of people really engaged in the purpose of an organization. The more purposeful an organization is, the more people are engaged. That's one thing we know. And engagement is often to do with kind of creative capacity, right? With people who are exhausted, who are scared, who are working too hard. The psychology of that is that they narrow down, they become less creative. And so there are things you can measure, and there are people out in the world who are doing quite a lot of research around this as to what are the behaviors and outcomes in organizations that change engagement. And there are lots of engagement surveys out there too. And so it might be an interesting place to start if you're actually attempting to make a kind of a change in a creative culture. Was measure engagement at the beginning, and measure engagement as you get further down the road.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. I'll take one more from the things that we have inside of the platform. I know we're definitely in the midst of the lesson on culture and ritual this week. And so I know there have been a lot of questions about what do you do when you have a very distributed team? What do you do when you, we have lots of people inside of the course who are working out of home offices or smaller offices, lots of companies that are distributed around the globe. And so there are lots of questions about rituals and pulling people together to have a certain kind of culture when they're all functioning in a distributed, globally distributed team.
One of the interesting things I've noticed about the rituals that people are exploring, and it may well be because the ritual example we used at IDEO was one that was in the same category, which is they're rituals to do with sharing. They're rituals to do with bringing people together, which are great. But there are other kinds of rituals that might be more relevant to the individual. One that we care about a lot at IDEO, and in fact, Paul Bennett, who shows up on the course, and you'll have seen his video by now, actually, I would have thought, he talks about this, the importance of essentially training to be creative, like an athlete. You have to be fit, right? Creatively fit. And so he talks about inspiration a lot, and the importance of inspiration. And there are inspirational rituals, right? There are things that, particularly things that you might do on your own. You know, I was looking at a really interesting example earlier on this year of somebody who every day for a year made a little pencil animation that he then digitally recorded. Literally he wanted to learn about animation, so he made one new animation every day for a year. And it was just a beautiful series. By the time we got to the end, they were so sophisticated. First ones were very crude. But that discipline allowed him to explore and master a whole new set of skills that he didn't have at the beginning. That's a great example of a ritual. I'm going to do something creative or inspirational every day. And I'm going to search for an image that I find inspiring. I'm going to go take a half-an-hour walk out in the woods and every day and think about new things. I mean, there are things one can do as an individual that are ritualistic that help with this idea of creative fitness, which I think is a great category of rituals that I would love to see people exploring more.
Yeah. So I think part of what I'm imagining would be great out of this is us challenging this community. If you're working on questions like this, we'd love to see ideas about rituals of inspiration. I think there are lots of things about people keeping space and time for creating these things. How can you do them in small micro moments?
Yeah.
I'm going to look up here and see some of the things that are rolling in. Lots of questions about failure. Last night in our meetup.
Well, people are always fascinated by failure, aren't they?
And it is one of the toughest things. It's one of those things that goes into the fear part of your brain right back here instead of the creative part of your brain up here. So Essen asks, Tim, do you have a story of failure that we can all learn from related to leading through creativity?
One of the things we do with failure is we kind of like blank it out, right, and turn it into something else. And so I always find it quite hard to think of really crisp examples of failure, because in some sense, in my view, I'm failing most of the time. Right. I mean, because it's a learning process, right? And I'm interested in learning. So I have an attitude towards life, which is I am very comfortable with putting hypotheses out there that are obviously wrong, but which by putting them out there, I actually think often by putting a hypothesis out there and having it, in a conversation or on a whiteboard with people, and then realizing it's completely wrong and learning from that. And so it's my primary mode. It's actually so arguably failure is my primary creative mode. And so it happens all the time. So that sometimes makes it a little bit hard for me to sort of then pull a really crisp example out. But
so it's just constant. It's all the time.
It's constant. And because failure isn't the failure to reach a goal. Failure is the incompleteness of something which you're doing, right? Or an idea that you have, and the learning that comes from that incompleteness that normally comes from the feedback from others, or by testing it in the real world in some way. That's the form of failure that I'm interested in. I mean, there are forms of catastrophic failure which you could certainly learn from. I mean, like the whole thing went wrong, right? I mean, we launched a product and nobody liked it, or we put a team together and the team completely blew up for some reason. But they're the forms of failure. While there is always learning involved in them, that those kind of catastrophic forms of failure, I do my best to avoid those if I can. I don't consider those to be preferable experiences. But I mean, the truth is, and I think part of the language, the problem with the language of failure in creativity and innovation is we think of those forms of failure and not this like every day or every moment version of failure, which I think is actually more useful. It literally is a mode of thought. Failure is a kind of creative mode, but it's a very lightweight failure, and it takes a certain amount of creative confidence to be willing to put your ideas out there, knowing that they're wrong, but preferring to do that because they'll get stronger faster than. And so so the most toxic thing to that in an environment when people respond to that in a nasty or aggressive or derogatory way. And so the thing that as a leader, a creative leader, you have to kind of stamp out in your organization are those interactions where somebody comes with that's a stupid idea, and here's why you're stupid, because that idea is stupid.
Yeah.
Right? Because that will shut that form of that creative mode down just like that in no time. There's plenty of opportunity to come back and say, I think this, and it's very different from what you think. But if you associate the failure of the idea with the failure of the individual, I mean, nobody in their right mind is going to enjoy that. Nobody's going to take those risks. Right? And so what you have to do as a leader is stamp out that version. And I find there are some kinds of cultures, particularly highly analytical ones, where winning is about having a very clear analytical argument, can sometimes lead to that association between kind of a stupidity of the idea and a stupidity of the individual.
And I love that idea that if you're flipping failure and you start to talk about instead prototyping and learning, it reframes it in a positive light and gives you, I always think of scripts that somebody can say when they want to try out a new behavior in an environment. So you're saying, instead of looking at something that might go wrong, what did you learn from that? How could we prototype that? How could we get these new things out? That's great. Terrific. Building on that, I think maybe Phil Hart is asking, how do you redirect someone or help them see their idea is not the best idea, but not undermine their confidence and creativity? And I think this is really big in lesson 3, is we're talking about how do you lead alongside, not just empower, but help people, nudge people.
And this is at the crux of what I think of as of kind of mastery of creativity, right? Which is one of the things that we see is that individuals that work together over time, do multiple projects over time, get better and better at this. Because what you end up building underneath the surface is a level of trust, right? The trust that even if somebody criticizes my idea, I know that they're doing it from the right place. And I know that ultimately we're going to get to a better place because we've done it before, right? And so the hardest time to do this is when a team's coming together for the first time, right? And so again, as a leader, you have to manage the emotions of that very carefully. You probably, if it's a team that's never worked together before, that's doing something quite difficult, you probably have to be more tolerant or more optimistic, if you like, and pick your moments where the kind of significant redirection is going to happen, in order to allow the individuals to build trust with each other and trust with you. And so it's an iterative process. It's one of the reasons why I believe creative teams do get better and better the longer they work together. Right? That actually, one of the challenges in the modern business environment where teams are often coming together in sort of random ways and don't spend a lot of time together is that trust is very hard to build. But ultimately, it's an incredibly valuable asset. And I see individuals that have worked together for a long time, in some cases, IDEO for years, who are able to be really quite critical of each other and it not be at all emotionally damaging, right? And it result in much, much better ideas.
What are some things, so trust being one of the key behaviors and beliefs that we know needs to be in place for creativity to flow, and I think it's at the very roots of being able to fail in order to learn. What are things that you've seen companies or IDEO do in order to build trust quickly, whether it's a ritual or some other conversation or technique?
Well, I mean, there's certainly, there's a lot that's used in all kinds of kind of psychological, all kinds of environments, I'd say, that, where getting beyond the sort of professional to the emotional, putting people together, taking people away, putting them in environments where they get to learn about each other as people, get to learn about their lives. I mean, that's all an important starting point. I mean, again, to expect people to walk into a room, never having met before, in a very professional kind of environment, not understanding the personalities of each other, and expect them to be vulnerable, which is what you want them to be in order to be creative, is a lot to ask, and most and most people won't do it, right? It takes time. And having an understanding of how personalities work. I mean, we do quite a lot of work of that at IDEO in various forms, using various tools. But actually understanding when somebody reacts in a certain way, it may well be because of the personality type they are and the personality type you are, not because of the quality of the idea. Mm-hmm. And when you understand the mechanisms of how, and the mechanics of how human beings interact with each other through the filter of their personalities, can actually help you pull the two apart and work much more effectively on the idea itself. So that's something we do a lot of at IDEO.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I know as a team, we've been reading all of the comments, listening to all of the questions inside of the platform, and there's been so much about how do we make space and time for culture and rituals. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that if you don't make time for culture, it's happening anyway. It's not like culture ever goes away. And so you're thinking about things like taking small amounts of time for that personal connection. And it doesn't have to be 8 hours of an offsite. But one of the things that I know we do a lot with client teams is an activity, wishes, hopes, and fears. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's such a simple question.
And that starts to reveal people's personalities too. Because the types of fears they talk about often reveal, are they a kind of a narcissistic personality where their fears are mostly about their own performance? Are they other kinds of personalities where the fear is more about the sort of what's going to end up happening because of that? I mean, there's lots of things that it starts to reveal. I mean, I really do believe, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, this idea of creative fitness, right? That it's like being an athlete, or even more, it's like being a team of athletes. It's like being a soccer team or a basketball team. That fitness is something you're striving for, right? And the fitter you are, the better you're going to be. Yeah. And these things take time, they take investment. I mean, you wouldn't ask, a team of professional athletes to walk on court, never having practiced before together, right? I mean, that would be ludicrous. In fact, it's interesting to see what happens in things like, the World Cup in football, or soccer, sorry, depending on what country, where the national teams often do much worse than the professional clubs. And the reason for that is they don't practice together, right? They haven't actually practiced together.
Yep, absolutely. Very hard. I think these are great. I'm going to keep looking up here so that we're pulling in more of the questions. I love this one from Evanel. How do you recharge your batteries as a leader to keep projecting great energy to keep the team engaged?
Well, I mean, I tell you how I do it by making sure that I get time to focus on my own creativity and do things that I find inspiring and creative, whether that's on making sure that I have time to contribute to the projects in which I'm helping teams, or whether it's because I have my own creative projects that I'm working on or just because I go out and visit museums or go to interesting gallery shows or get out into the world and just travel for me is something I find very creative and inspiring. Or go visit interesting people, or whatever it might be. I make sure I find time for that, and I don't see that as kind of goofing off or somehow sidestepping my responsibilities. I actually see it as a responsibility, right? Because if I'm not creatively inspired, if I'm not creatively energized, then how can I expect my team to be, right? And in fact, if I'm exhausted and overworked, and I start kind of narrowing down my perspective, I will do a less good job of helping them be successful. And more important, and then I'm also acting as a really bad role model, because if they're doing that, they most certainly won't be creative. So you can't lead creatively from a point of exhaustion. It's simply impossible.
Well, it's so interesting just hearing you say that. Reminds me of a conversation we had maybe 6 months ago, thinking about how things were going with IDEO U and making sure as we're building out the team and bringing in more leaders that I'm talking openly with people on the team about the projects where I want to go deep, because I'm curious to tackle those questions. And how do you just have a conversation about it instead of trying to stand back too far because you're being the leader of everything? How do you pick the little places where those are your topics you're fascinated
And it's more complex for a leader, right? Because you do have these other responsibilities. And so it takes more discipline. It takes a greater mastery, if you like. And it takes knowing where the edges of your own performance are, right? I mean, if you know that when you've just got off an airplane, having flown a transatlantic flight, and that you're less likely to be open-minded, then don't set up a review meeting with a project team just after you've got off a plane. It's in nobody's interest to do that, right? No matter how, crunched your calendar is. I mean, again, I think for me, it's like step back to have this. You should always have the question of, is this the fittest thing that I could do, right? Am I leading to greater fitness in my own fitness and the fitness of of those that I'm helping lead? And it's not that hard to come to a kind of an intuition or have evidence. It's like one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I know one of the things that we've been doing as we've been developing content for IDEO U and doing all of these things with changes and advances across IDEO is thinking a lot about what are creativity competencies. And one of the ones that we've really identified that's so central to everything else is that self-awareness, that ability to reflect, the ability to make time to check in with yourself and say, is this the time to go which direction?
I mean, there's been a huge movement in management and leadership over the last 10 years that, managers and leaders who, in order to be successful, have to be healthy, right? I mean, if you're unhealthy, it's very hard to lead others, right? And so there's been a lot of work on that, a lot of money spent on that, a lot of help that are given to leaders to be healthy in mind and body. Well, this is another form of that we're talking about. If you're not healthy from a kind of in the sense of being inspired, if you're not healthy in the sense of being energized and engaged, you will not be a good creative leader.
Yeah. So some questions are up here about that from Lance. We've talked a little bit about this personal rituals, either that you have as a leader or some of the creative muscles that you work on the team with to keep them on their edge.
Well, I just try and my own rituals are ones of, I love sharing creative experiences I've had with people. Right? So I'm not sure that's a ritual as such, but I find it's one of the ways in which I can energize a team. Right. So instead of getting all excited about an idea as such, what I love to bring is, because I spend a lot of my time doing a lot of different things, and so I get to cross connect. Right. I mean, that's one of my values that I bring the organization. Right? I get to join dots in interesting ways, and I see that as a creative exercise, something I've always enjoyed. And so when I do that, and I have points of inspiration that come from, I might be working with a team on, autonomous vehicles and mobility, and I've just come from a conversation in the healthcare industry, and I've got some inspiration. So, this is how these people are thinking about that. Wouldn't it be interesting to think about this in this context? That those kinds of, I find that very creatively energizing to make those connections, and I think it's often useful for the team because it gives them some new questions to ask or some new things to explore. So that's one of the. So I feel like if I'm not making those new patterns, then there's something missing from my own sort of creative life, as it were. And so I sense it, right? I go through periods where I'm doing a lot of it and I feel great, and then I'll go through periods where I'm so busy or I'm not having the right kinds of experiences, the right kinds of meetings, whatever it might be, that I'm not doing it as much and I feel less satisfied. So that's one of the kind of. I have this little gauge in my head. It's like my pattern making needle. Is it healthy or is it unhealthy?
Nice, great. I'm glad to see this one here. There are a couple things that we've seen where it's about turning leaders. So I think we have a lot of people who are leading teams inside of this course, and they're thinking about the overarching corporation or organization or enterprise that they're in. And leaders there might not recognize the value of some of these creative behaviors or techniques. And I'm curious to know if you have any tips or things that you've seen work in the past where somebody's kind of helping to influence up in the organization and get leaders above them to accept these.
I was actually having a very interesting conversation by email with an old client of ours actually about this topic last couple of weeks, because I think he'd interpreted some things that I've been saying as being, you can't do anything in an organization unless the senior leaders buy into this idea of creativity and design thinking, and I appreciated the fact that one could interpret what I say that way. What I actually believe is that if you want fundamental transformation across the organization, you ultimately do need that, but it's a lot to ask. And means that relatively few organizations are going to take this journey on if in order to do that the CEO has to believe. So it's a very interesting conversation, and this person had lots of evidence to show how they in their organization, it was a very big organization, had started to make progress without having that senior leadership buy-in, really it was all about showing the evidence of winning, right? It was showing the evidence of doing things more creatively, doing things that are more customer focused, whatever it might be, and actually showing evidence to leaders that this is a better way of doing it, right? So obviously that's one way of creating kind of that slow, steady, incremental, but important change, right? To show the evidence that the ideas are better, or that they're more closely aligned with what consumers and customers want, or or that we more fully understand our ideas, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I know one thing that I always love that has come quite often out of our London office, and I think a kind of a mantra that many of us have is do small things, tell big stories, right? So it might just be that the concept is a little better, or that the session that you had reached a better quality, or you got deeper. It doesn't have to be all the way to market.
And get good at capturing evidence. You know, one of the things that's come out time and time again, I think over experience at IDEO, is that often what leaders find most compelling, not necessarily the end ideas, it's the insights that got them there, right? The customer insights, or the insights about the organization, or maybe some insights about how you connect technology needs or technology to customer needs, whatever it might be. And they're often things that leaders find very interesting because they're a new way of looking at the future. And so make sure you're really good at telling those stories. Identify the good ones and actually be very good at telling them. And then the final thing I'd say is that in the end, you can't argue your way to convincing people to be more creative or to support being more creative. They have to experience it. Right? I mean, it's true for all of us. I mean, isn't it? Because so much of being creative, of design thinking is sort of common sense, and it's experienced. It's not. You can't build a big intellectual argument for it very easily. And so the last thing I would advise is just look for opportunities where you may be able to bring these senior leaders into the experience. I mean, I remember many years ago we had a sort of a summit meeting with a series of all the senior leaders from the big pharmaceutical company we were working with, and so I took actually he'd been named as the new CEO. He hadn't yet taken over CEO. I took him out, and we went to visit a customer, a patient, right, who was using one of their drugs. She had rheumatoid arthritis, I think, and went into her home, and something he'd never done before, and saw how painful the whole experience of her disease, of the experience of injecting the drug, how the whole experience was painful. And it was completely, mind-shattering for him because he rightly believed in the goodness of the drugs that they were creating, but had no understanding of what the actual customer experience was. And from that moment, he continues to be the CEO of this company today, 15 years later. He has been a huge advocate of the importance of design-mindedness, of understanding the real needs of users. And I really do attribute that experience has been the beginning of that journey for him. And we just basically did, we had him in a meeting, so we just used it as an excuse to go out and have him meet a customer.
Yeah, that's great. So evidence, stories, and then even a micro direct.
If you just find ways of having these leaders have some part of the experience, it can really make a big difference.
That's great. Is there anything you're seeing up here that you're curious to answer? I know there's lots of great questions. Go ahead.
So I quite like this question about from David about how does creative fellowship relate to creative leadership?
Yeah,
I've not really thought about the concept of creative fellowship. I would suggest, but I don't know how much evidence I have, that my gut would say that actually anybody that's really involved in a creative process is in some way being a creative leader, and that it's more of a scale thing, right? We have to learn new skills, and I talked about it right at the beginning. I had to learn that skill of balancing the importance of my own idea with the importance of other people's ideas, and that's, I think, more often something that many creative people have a hard time with. But so there are those kinds of skills you have to learn. But there's some level of leadership required, even for somebody who's just kind of coming into their career as a creative person, because it's a very difficult set of circumstances to kind of orchestrate, right? And it requires certain things like good decision making. It requires an open-mindedness. It requires curiosity. We've talked about that a lot. They're all leadership qualities.
Yep.
It requires engagement. It requires thinking forward. All of these things that I think of as being leadership qualities. So in order to be a great creative follower, you kind of also have to be a leader. You may not have some of the personality skills yet for projecting that leadership in a way that goes beyond yourself, and that's something we tend to learn as we go along. One of the things that we found, I know at IDEO, is that a lot of great creative people are actually introverts. They're not extroverts, right? And so I may be a little bit more extroverted, although I think of myself as an introvert. I mean, you've seen me at a party. I'm the one at the edge of the room, not talking to people. I'm not walking up, and so I've had to learn some of those. I mean, extrovert in some ways, but not in others. And I think that's true of a lot of creative people. So it's not. It's certainly. I would never argue that in order to be a creative leader, you have to be a natural extrovert. And in fact, I find a lot of natural extroverts are not great creative leaders because they're not always very curious.
Yeah.
A lot of natural extroverts are great at relationship building, but they're not necessarily curious about the conversation itself.
It's interesting. So I feel like we're talking about practicing. Following is very different. It's not just doing what you've been told. It's practicing a set of behaviors at different scale.
If you think about the sort of basic framework that we talk about in the course, this idea of leading from these different stances, from in front, from alongside, and from behind. I mean, that is a concept of service in a way, right? I mean, that is leader as kind of a service style of leadership, not leadership only as being the one in the front. And so there are moments when actually, in order to be a leader, you actually have to be a follower. And so I think it may be that the word is not a word. I mean, the word leadership is a difficult word, right? Because it's got so many historical connotations to it. But I think we're getting more sophisticated about how we think about that word.
Definitely. I know we just have a few minutes left, so probably last two questions. I think a lot of people are curious to learn more about you and your personal struggles. We've got one from Fran here about thinking through what are some of your weaknesses as a leader, and how do you manage them?
The list of weaknesses is a long one. We could spend another hour talking about that if we really wanted to. But one we talked about, right, which is this struggle I had with sort of this idea of arguing my own ideas, and that became more of a weakness over time. It was a strength at the beginning, and it became a weakness. And that's something we have to remember. Sometimes our strengths, for instance, I know a lot of creative people are just very good at taking ideas and just going and getting on with something. And when you're a part of a creative team, that's great. As you get on to be a creative leader, either that can be very frustrating when you're not the one that's getting on with things, or if you just go and get on with stuff, you can disenfranchise the team. So that's something that another battle I constantly fight is that if I was to say which between proactive and reactive, I'm a slightly reactive person, right? I respond to the emergency of the moment, or I respond to what other people want me to do. And so it is a bit of a battle for me sometimes to keep enough space for me to do the things I know I should be doing, or for me to stay creatively inspired. I mean, I do find that there are moments when I agree to do a lot of things, like a lot of travel, for instance, which I know reduces my creative performance. Right? I mean, I just know it does. Right? And so I've had to learn, and I actually need a lot of help. I mean, from others, just like to help me defend space, or remember not to go crazy with the travel if I actually want to go make a decent contribution to something. And so that's a weakness that I constantly battle. It's a very difficult one, because part of my job as a CEO is to do lots of different things and to represent the company like myself. So it's very easy to say yes to lots of things, and it can be very satisfying to one's ego to be asked to do lots of things, right? And so having the strength of mind to know how to make good choices is something that's a constant battle for me.
Yeah, definitely. I always think about the roller coaster ride. Sometimes you're out and you're going through the leadership tunnel and you're doing all these things publicly, and then you come back and need that space.
Well, one thing I've noticed in my own experience is that if you like, the more senior my leadership role has been, the more often I'm off doing things on my own. Yeah. And then when I reflect back and think, well, how have I helped others become better leaders in the last week? Well, it could be I really haven't helped other people at all, because I haven't been with other people. I've been on airplanes, I've been speaking in front of crowds, I've been, whatever, but I haven't actually been helping other people. And now I used to not think about it. Now I think okay, that's a loss, right? Whenever that happens, that's less optimal, that's less good. And so I find myself now trying to find ways, even when I am going and doing things, of trying to include other people, so that I might be able to provide some help to them. or to turn them into kind of creative activities in different ways.
Yeah.
But that took me a long time to realize.
Yeah. Okay, last question. We've got one from Julie here about encouraging creative confidence in your team to develop beyond the workplace and into like these micro daily habits. So is there something that you want to challenge some of the people who are listening today inside of the course? How would you challenge them to develop daily habits around honing creative confidence?
You know, one of the things we do at IDEO a lot is we try and uncover people's creative passions that are outside of the work they do. I mean, we believe in people bringing creativity to their work, obviously, but it's very common, as much as I do, to find people who've got other creative passions that actually contribute to their work, but more importantly, they contribute to their continued creative energy, right, and engagement. So whether that's, cooking or painting or whatever it might be. I mean, we have musicians. We have endless musicians at IDEO. But trying and letting them bring that into their work. So not having it be the thing that they do in order to counterbalance what they're doing at work, but how can it connect in some way? How can it support and help their creativity at work, and encouraging people to find time for that and to continue to invest in it. And I would say, first step one, if you're leading a team, is trying to uncover what those passions might be, and give people a chance to sort of bring them to the team.
Bring the outside in.
Bring the outside in.
One of the things we always talk about, and it's just it seems like you're spending time on something that's not direct line to results, but people always thank you for it afterwards.
It's amazing
how
often,
good about it.
Another version of that we have is we have this. I guess it is a ritual really at IDEO, but we have this thing we do called IDEO Stories, where we every 3 or 4 months, a small group of folks will basically come and present their own kind of personal creative story or their own story of their own life, and it's remarkable how much comes out of that. I mean, it's completely changed people's perceptions of certain individuals at IDEO through those stories. So that's another way of doing it.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, but it has been absolutely amazing. Your questions are incredibly powerful. Thank you for all of the things that you're asking us, all of the hard work that you're doing. This course ends next Wednesday, but we really love seeing your submissions. We'll keep giving feedback. We've got a couple more ways to get feedback and comments to you. And we'll post this for folks who hadn't seen it yet. And we'll see you back in class.
Yeah, good luck with the rest of the course.
Thank you.